exciting series of speakers. Liena Kano from the University of Calgary, Gabriel Benito from the Norwegian Business School, and Nicola Pisani from the University of Amsterdam. We're going to focus on three papers. The first paper, Global Value Chains, a review of the multidisciplinary literature, which is co-authored by Liena, Eric Tsang, and Henry Wai-chung Yeung. The second paper, The Global Value Chain and Internationalization Theory, co-authored with Gabriel, Benito, Ben Petersen, and Lawrence Welch. And the final paper, Accounting for Firm Heterogeneity in Global Value Chains by Fabienne Fortanier, Guannan, Miao, Kolk, and Nicola Pisani. We picked these three papers specifically because of the kind of the flow that you could probably see immediately, which goes from a kind of a review of the entire literature to a link with well-established theory to a more empirical examination of global value chain. So the papers are meant to be complementary in a sense. So without much further ado, what I'm going to do is hand over to Liena and let her begin the webinar. So Liena.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'd like to say first and foremost that we are incredibly honored to have our work included in this seminar series and generally very excited about seeing this initiative going forward. This is a joint effort with Eric Tsang from UT Dallas and Henry Yeung from the National University of Singapore, where we review the literature on global value chains. Now, GVCs have been studied in a very wide range of disciplines, especially in the last 20 years. But there hasn't really been a systematic large-scale review specifically from the IB perspective. And this is precisely what we set out to accomplish. We bring together different complementary literature streams, but the paper is essentially written for the IB audience. Our conceptual starting point for approaching the review is comparative institutional analysis, which is embodied in transaction cost economics and internalization theory. And our inspiration for organizing the review was this three-layer contractual schema from Oliver Williamson. As an aside, I think many of you will know that Williamson passed away, unfortunately, last week. So I'd like to see this perhaps as a small tribute to his legacy. So the core idea of Williamson's framework is that organizations are affected and in turn affect their micro and macro level environments through changes in governance. So we took this idea and we adapted it to the GVC context in that we link micro level insights with insights at the macro level about various characteristics of relevant environments with the actual processes and outcomes of governance at the level of the GVC. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a flavor of what we found at each of these layers and also discuss what we actually don't know much about and what we think we should focus on going forward. So starting with micro foundations, this appears to be one of the least researched aspects of global value chains. And that is unfortunate because the configurations of global value chains are essentially outcomes of managers' decisions. And the individual level features of managers can and do affect the efficiency of global value chains. To give you just a few examples, managers routinely underestimate the cost and overestimate the ability to coordinate inputs and outputs globally. They actually have a hard time accounting where exactly value is created in global value chains. They may hold diverging sets of beliefs and values, and that creates functional silos, which of course inhibit the ability of the global value chain to function smoothly. So some solutions were proposed in the literature, such as fostering common identity and language in GVCs, deploying relational mechanisms, developing and building upon individual capabilities. But we think that there's still quite a bit of work to be done in this area. So we suggest that future studies should explicate behavioral assumptions and examine the links between these assumptions and various components of GVC governance, such as ownership and control decisions, geographic and structural configurations, knowledge sharing, to name but a few. At the GVC level, we distinguish between structural and strategic governance. Structural governance refers to decisions specifically about the structure of the network. So the make or buy decisions, location choices, the composition and size of the network. And of course, these decisions are impacted by macro level characteristics of locations. But the primary driver of structured decisions appears to be firm level strategy. And what's important here in this realm is that control of knowledge is becoming increasingly more important than ownership of physical assets. Also, the structure of global value chains appears to also be determined by the orchestration capabilities of the lead firm. For example, the firm's ability to fine slice its value chain or its ability to achieve specialization of production. And this leads me to the other side of the governance equation, to the strategic governance. And this refers to the actual managerial processes and routines dealing with strategic decisions, including resource orchestration, knowledge sharing, value distribution in the value chain, and so on. So there is a fair degree of consensus here that in order to influence the network, the lead firm has to have strong technological capabilities. But technical competencies are not enough. And perhaps even more important is what Buckley and Tian termed global orchestration know-how. So it's the ability of the lead firm to guide the network in an entrepreneurial way. And this is perhaps why most of the global value chains are led by firms from advanced economies. It's because the emerging market multinationals are fairly new to the GVC game, and they have not yet had the time to develop this orchestration capabilities to guide their networks efficiently. Now, relational governance is very important, particularly in situations where products are complex, where there are no consistent industry standards or processes are less codifiable. And lastly, value distribution is seen by some IB scholars, including myself, as an orchestration tool. But our review showed that lead firms have a hard time accurately measuring value creation in the network, let alone using it as a deliberate orchestration tool. So this is definitely something that we should study more deeply in the future. How can lead firms account for creation of the value, and how do they actually distribute it? And this relates to the previous point I made on micro foundations. The issue here is that a lot of work that addresses value distribution in global value chains, especially work conducted from the power view perspective, makes an implicit assumption of opportunism on the part of the lead firm. But what we found is that this assumption is very rarely actually tested. So I really think that in order to study value distribution credibly, we have to start with accurate behavioral assumptions. At the macro level, I'll just make two brief points. The macro level impacts are dynamic. For example, as institutions develop, so do the supplier strategies for upgrading by switching to greater use of internal R&D, for example. And of course, as digital technologies develop, firms have access to new tools for either fragmenting their GVCs further or, on the contrary, creating additional links. and otherwise reconfiguring their value chains. So we really have to keep this dynamism in mind when we study global value chains. The other point here is that these impacts are double-sided. But the feedback effects from GVCs on their macro environment is actually studied quite a bit less. For example, we know that GVCs can change institutional quality in relevant countries, but we actually know fairly little about the mechanisms through which this change occurs. And when it comes to the impact of GVCs on the environment, societies, and economies, whether or not this impact is positive or negative is, of course, hotly debated in a number of forums, but we found fairly little empirical scholarly work that addresses this impact, at least in the journals that we surveyed. And this gap is particularly evident in IB and general management literature as compared to other social sciences. So this is definitely one of the grand challenges of future research in IB that we should address. The other ones related to the macro level being the impact of renewed protectionism, which is very relevant now. So this is something that was discussed last week, as well as the impact of digitization. So this is the subject of next week's webinar, so I'm not going to go into it today. And lastly, performance outcomes of global value chain. I have to say here that the majority of the work that we reviewed was concerned more with developing typologies, studying processes, mapping linkages, and not addressing performance per se. Now, of course, there is work that looks at performance, and performance of the GVC as a network at the network level is particularly interesting because there are a lot of ways to operationalize it and conceptualize it, from flexibility of the network to its innovation capability to its development impact. The performance at the network level appears to be very difficult to quantify, so it's mostly addressed through qualitative inquiry. And there is no consensus presently on what actually constitutes superior performance of a global value chain. Now, from our perspective, a GVC is going to be sustainable over a long period of time only if it is more efficient compared to other governance options. So we propose that perhaps the long-term sustainability of the network could be seen as its ultimate performance. And this suggests the last avenue for future research. And this is actually something that was not in the paper, but it emerged through our discussion with my co-authors over the last couple of days. How can GVCs remain resilient in light of external shocks, such as, for example, the global pandemic, but more broadly, how can they sustain themselves over long periods of time in the changing risk environment that characterizes today? So I have now, I think, scraped the surface of the GVC literature, but I'm going to stop here. And thank you very much for listening. And thank you very much to my co-authors for this fantastic experience of working on this paper.
Okay, thank you, Liena. As I'd like to sort of kind of say in the break, please ask your questions, use the Q&A function. We have a few questions, but literally anything comes into your mind, I can sort of kind of organize for you. Our second speaker is Gabriel Benito. He's joining us from his lockdown in Norway. He will talk about his recent paper, The Global Value Chain and Internationalization Theory. So over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Tim. I'll share the screen, my screen with you. So do you have it?
Yes.
Okay, so everything is working? Yeah. Well, going after Liena with this fantastic and broad and deep overview of the field, feels like a little bit like to being the ski jumper that jumps after the current world champion or something. But our paper is a much more focused, narrow, sort of targeted paper. But I'll try to sort of build on what Liena said and fill in the cracks perhaps a little bit. This is a presentation that is based on an article written with Ben Petersen and Lawrence Welch. I just have, oh, there it is. Okay. It was actually written as an exchange article with another article in the same issue by Strange and Humphrey. And it's a commentary, almost of a counterpoint to that article, and needs to be read in that context. Although we try to also give it its own value and standalone quality. The paper obviously is about global value chains, and by that we mean a value system that's made up of activities separated in space to be geography, polity, and so forth, and that also runs across organizational boundaries of various types of units. Secondly, it's about internalization theory. Internalization theory is a general theory of economic organization. It's also one of the real true workhorses in international business. And what we do in the article is that we discuss that theory's description and analysis of global value chains, and we try to sort out what that theory explains well in global value chains and what it explains less well. And then we contrast that or compare internalization theory to research that has developed more with a focus on the phenomenon itself that emerges from analysis of global value chains and what we can broadly call the global value chain approach. And a prominent example of that is the work by Gabriel, but also others. And there's a very large literature which Liena and her authors covers very well in that review article. So in the article, what we do is that we compare internalization theory and the global value chain approach, and we have an emphasis on what the theories say about choices and changes. So the more static phenomena of making strategic choices and more sort of dynamic phenomena within global value chains. And then we can sort of get back to basics. Internalization theory is about the governance choices, and that may include, of course, location of production choices too. But usually we zoom on the governance given those conditions. Although there are some interdependencies here, and that is well recognized in the theory. Those choices are based on efficiency criteria. So theory sees the global value chain as the aggregation, as the end result of many separate or discrete decisions having been made about those governing choices given production, location, and so forth. The emphasis on the theory, and I think this is important, is on making the right ex ante, the right governance decisions. And this is important because ex post performance or efficiency results from those ex ante choices. It's costly to make governance changes, and adaptation preferably takes place within the choices that have been made, the governance choices that have been made. So that's one particular view of how economic systems work in terms of the decisions regarding governance. The global value chain approach is somewhat different in the sense that it also recognizes efficiency, but there are other things that get into the equation. Among them would be power as a way, as a factor that influences how those global value chains are configured, and also how the relations between the actors and units, including the relation to the lead firm, looks like. So a significant difference then is that the global value chain approach sees this as a system. And the system itself is sort of designed in a way, may sometimes emerge or develop, but there's an explicit recognition of interdependencies that are within the system. And it's also broadly acknowledged that there will be a continuous need for making adjustments, for making changes ex post. And this is brought directly into this theory as such. Now, moving down from the system level down to the interfaces between actors and units in the global value chains, also other differences emerge that or become evident that are important. Internalization theory presupposes coordination either through some kind of a direction mechanism, that could be, for example, rules or fiat, which would be sort of firm-like relations, or some self-oriented decision-making incentives. That would be more a market-like type of relations. Of course, both of them are voluntary. And that is a basis for internalization theory, that there's a high degree of voluntarism upon which people relate to each other. The global value chain approach brings in a much broader set of possible coordination mechanisms, including social norms, even trust. And if you go really to the extreme end of the scale, possibly even with power considerations, coercion, exclusion, and other sort of more dirty tactics in economic dealings. So I will just point out the trust, which generally is seen as good, so the miracle oil of social machineries, that works particularly well when it has public good properties, when it's institutional-based. The so-called secret of how the Nordic countries, apart from Sweden, have ventured so well through the COVID-19 crisis is, this amazing, supposedly amazing trust that we have in institutions and society at large. So everything works well because we actually listen to experts and we follow their advice. This is rarely the case in international settings, unless there are a couple of interesting exceptions. There are communities that cross borders, could be the diasporas or migrant clusters that keep strong relations to their original countries, or it could be that this is a conscious effort through significant and very credible bonding investments that are made to what actually develop this trust and nurture it. But this doesn't come free, and it's actually quite expensive to do, and particularly in a heterogeneous system like a global value chain would be. So, what are my point here is that the scope of internalization theory is more restricted to value chains that are based on economic grounds. Whenever other considerations enter into the picture, internalization theory loses its ability to explain this, although it still serves as a benchmark in terms of efficiency. But it may lose out in terms of actually explaining what we see happening before our eyes. So does it matter? Let me end with a couple of more speculative conjectures about global value chains in what may become the new normal. And the new normal moving forward seems to be strong pressures for closer, shorter, more resilient global value chains. Macro level factors such as nationalism, protectionism, and so forth play into them much more strongly than before. If that is the case, we should expect, among other things, the following: less fine slicing of activities, especially those that are border crossing, less geographical dispersion, more concentration, more biased preferences for the known, both in terms of locations and actors. And that will lead to fewer economies in terms of specialization and comparative advantage. What this means is that if this is true, we're going to see less efficient global value chains emerge and be configured in the years to come. The second point is that there will be a preference for more flexible global value chains. Well, that means that you have to build that flexibility into the system. That could be, for example, concurrent sourcing. It could be alternative locations. That is all good, but also increases complexity. That is a cost component. That will be more costly. Thirdly, and it follows from the two points above, more changeable global value chains configurations, together with those less efficient choices, will, I think, lead to a pressure towards more dynamism, to restructure in the quest for efficiency, more and more reconfigurations, but in many ways not getting there because the basis for achieving efficiency isn't there. It's just that the pressure to try to get it will still be there. But at the same time, we also see then, because incentives are less at play, and underinvestment in collected actions such as innovation, competence development, operational abilities, and so forth in those global value chains, and that will be again a cost. So, to me, at least, that suggests that looking at global value chains solely from the perspective of internationalization theory may become a bit myopic in the future, so to speak, unfortunately, and that other perspectives on global value chains may win out because they actually provide a closer picture of what we seem to be observing. But with that, I'll stop and thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. The third speaker today is Nicola Pisani, who is joining us from the Netherlands at the University of Amsterdam. And he's going to talk about his recent paper, Accounting for Firm Heterogeneity in Global Value Chains. So we move from the theoretical to the empirical. So Nicola.
Yes, thanks. I think, Gabriel, you need to unshare your screen so that I can... Okay, so, well, thank you very much, Tim and the organizers of the webinar for the opportunity to present our work. I'm delighted to present it on behalf of my co-authors, Fabienne Fortanier, Dutch National Bank and previously at OECD, Guannan Miao at the OECD, and my colleague Kolk from the University of Amsterdam. As both Liena and Gabriel pointed out in their presentation, firms have increasingly fine-sliced their value chains across geography in the recent past. Previous studies have focused on very important aspects of those newly formed global value chains. The studies have also highlighted the need for better measurement methods. In our paper that is a methodology research note, we precisely present a new method that has been recently developed at the OECD Statistics and Data Directorate. And this new method integrates previously used research tools, and we think it gives a great opportunity for future research to IB scholars, as it allows them to shed new light on how specific firm characteristics play a role in the formation and configuration of global value chains. Up until now, three main research tools have been used to study global value chains. The first has been firm-level surveys, and IB scholars have primarily used firm-level surveys to investigate JVCs. They've been very useful to highlight microdynamics and micro characteristics of global value chains, at the detriment, though, of reaching generalizability, mainly because of their relatively limited sample sizes. The second tool has been international trade statistics. Those statistics have been very useful because they have shown how countries are interconnected in terms of their exchange of goods and services. However, they suffer of the opposite limitation, as they have been very macro, as obviously we have those statistics only at the country level. The third tool that has been mainly used by international economists has been the inter-country input-output models. These models have put together supply use or input-output tables at the national level and international trade statistics. Therefore, they have been very useful in showing not only inter-country, but also inter-industry linkages. This third method, however, hasn't been able to shed any light on intra-industry firm heterogeneity. The method we present in our work uses instead both firm-level microdata and inter-country IO models. And therefore, it really allows researchers to undertake comprehensive and yet very fine-grained analysis as it integrates firm, industry, and country level. It is done by disaggregating IO tables by firm characteristics. And in the paper, we specify and discuss the individual steps that need to be taken in order to reach this disaggregation. And it's very interesting because the methodology we present allows for an assessment of firms' second and third order linkages, so the local backward linkages that firms are able to establish in the countries where they operate. And this is key to understand global value chains. In our paper, we also present an illustrative application of the methodology. And we do so by focusing on a key firm characteristic, that is firm ownership, specifically distinguishing between multinational enterprises and domestic firms. And we do so by distinguishing between foreign control affiliates versus their domestic counterparts, so those firms that are domestically controlled. In the illustrative application, therefore, we look at how multinationals actually engage in global value chains in the countries where they operate, how this engagement is different from that of the domestic firms, and how it varies across countries and industries. We use data on firm ownership in 27 industries of 19 OECD countries for the 2011-2014 period. I will focus here on the two key findings that we obtained in our analysis. The first key finding is the identification of what we label as an M&E effect. And that is that M&E's contribution to value-added exports is considerably smaller than what has been suggested by traditional trade statistics that have focused on gross exports. Let me explain this further using the figure that is on the slide. This means that if you see across all countries that we have in our sample, on average, foreign controlled affiliates' share in gross exports is about 45%. However, if you look at the contribution of multinational subsidiaries, essentially, to value-added exports in all the countries we sampled, is significantly below across all countries and equals roughly 30%. MNE's smaller contribution to value-added exports is intrinsically associated with their sourcing strategies. This means that MNEs, as you can see here from the figure in the slide, have been traditionally importing more than their domestic counterparts. If you see here, the foreign value-added content as a share of total exports is higher in multinationals compared to domestic firms across all countries considered in our analysis, which means on average, foreign controlled affiliates, so multinational subsidiaries, tend to import more and use more of that import into their export from those countries. Traditionally, a higher import content of exports has been linked to the creation of fewer local backward linkages. And local backward linkages in the IB literature, and they have been broadly considered a very important element and a very important contribution of multinationals to the host economies in which they operate. The second important key finding we're able to unveil through this new methodology is that, in fact, even though multinationals, is true, have a higher import content of exports, the local backward linkages created by multinationals are very similar to those generated by local firms. If you see in the figure that I show in this slide, we see that across all countries that we sample, there is no clear pattern of one having or generating more local backward linkages than other. It is highly country specific. And when we also look at the industry analysis that is reported in the paper, we see no clear pattern of multinational creating fewer local backward linkages than domestic firms. On the opposite, in many countries, they do create more. And to be able to see that, as you can see on the y-axis, we look at the ratio of indirect value added over direct value added content of export, which means we look at the amount of US dollars in value added that is generated at upstream suppliers for every dollar that either the foreign control affiliate or the domestic firms generates directly. So we really look at the full size of upstream value creation of every single entity in the sample. If you look here, putting together these two key findings, we look at the correlation and we see the clear pattern that I discussed earlier. On the x-axis, you see the import content of export, and it's clear that on average, foreign control affiliates do tend to import more, so to have a higher import content of exports. But if you see at the y-axis, that reports again the ratio of indirect value added over direct value added content of exports, you do not see a clear pattern. That is, on average, multinationals and domestic firms have a very similar tendency to establish local backward linkages. This is very likely a function of the much higher specialization in only parts of the production process that multinational enterprises have when established their subsidiaries abroad compared with their domestic counterparts. To conclude, in our paper, we introduce and discuss a new method to analyze global value chains that we think really has great potential for IB scholarship, because IB scholars are best equipped, not only from a theoretical standpoint, but also from an empirical one, to really leverage the advantages provided by this new methodology and the data that is increasingly available that allows for this methodology to be used. Through our illustrative application, we are able to uncover a very important aspect related to the role of M&Es across global value chains, and the fact that, in fact, despite they have a higher import content of export, they do not create fewer local backward linkages than their domestic counterparts. And this could not be shown before because of data limitations. And the third is that in the paper, we also discuss and provide some useful information about the increasing availability of data that allows this new methodology to be applied, that is available from countries' national statistics agency, and that we believe really offers new avenues for interesting future IB research that can really enhance our understanding of global value chains formation and configuration. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. So you can, there you go. Thank you. We now have approximately half an hour or so, maybe 25 minutes for some questions. Fascinating all around, from the look at the literature through comparison across theory to the empirics. We have a number of provocative questions, I guess. The first one, which I'd like to kind of aim a little bit at Liena and then Niccolo, is to link what we've heard today to a bit of the last webinar. So Michael Viet is asking essentially what's the link between the global value chains and protectionism, and Gabriel may come in a little bit at the last point here on deglobalization, but the issue related to let's say pressures for or the distribution of protectionist actions going forward. So I'd like to sort of kind of ask Liena first a little bit about the literature aspect of this, but to come back to Niccolo on, well, what would the data imply here? Are the multinationals really providing the value that we have always argued that they provided, and therefore the country should in fact be far more open? And this is also related a little bit to a question that's being asked by Ruth Aguilera, and that has to do with the distribution of the countries through which those global value chains pass. How important is that? And are we sort of missing a bit of that link? So Liena.
So on the impact of protectionism, it's still shaping up. So in our review, we actually have not seen a lot that's already published, but it's a function of the fact that the renewed protectionism is a fairly new phenomenon. Protectionism in itself is not, but of course the Trumpism and Brexit and their impacts have not yet made it fully into the published literature. That being said, we have flagged it as a direction for future research. And of course, now with COVID, is going to exacerbate the protectionist tendencies. And Gabriel sort of has answered this question by suggesting that there's going to be more pressure to localize, to make value chains shorter, more localized, perhaps at the expense of efficiency. But there's another side to this. And that is that reshoring is not always easy, and it doesn't always happen for macro level pressure reasons. And some of the literature that we reviewed, for example, a study by Ann Karani, suggests that strategic reasons sometimes are the main reasons for reshoring. Further, it can be actually not even feasible, and even in the face of the US-China trade war, repatriating production, let's say from China, would require a company to have access to specialized skills, access to large-scale manufacturing. And the reality is that presently, no country can match China's combination of scale and skill and cost. So in theory, we can expect attempted reshoring, but in practice, it may be quite difficult. That being said, there is technology there that actually works along the way with this trend, because, for example, the 3D printing technology actually enables value chains to be shorter and more localized and perhaps more regionalized. So I think we're going to definitely have to look at it in the future. The data on protectionism, as it was pointed out last week, is presently quite limited. But I think that the access to this data is going to increase as the impacts unfold. And if I may make just one more comment, and it relates to Gabriel's point on that we may see as a result of the pandemic and the protectionist tendencies, less common value-added functions such as joint innovation. It may be true, but as an eternal optimist, I'd also like to point out that we are now seeing some incredible cooperation in regards with developing the cure and vaccine for COVID-19. And we see R&D collaboration from large pharmaceutical companies, with WHO being at the center and serving as a hub for directing innovation and distributing information among participants, and different layers of society and businesses participating. So perhaps we can take this as a sign that in some industries, joint innovation may become the new norm, spurred by external shocks, such as the one that we're experiencing now.
Okay. Niccolo?
Yes. So, well, first, I have a comment on the data and what we will see as a result of this increasing protectionism. The data and the analysis that we show precisely in the paper do come out with a lag, in the sense that not so much the national level data, but especially the firm level ones are collected by national statistics agencies. And normally this take a while before they are able to harmonize the data received and be able to match it with the national level one. So unfortunately, although we would all like and be able to have immediate useful data to better analyze the short-term consequences of changes in policy, for those kind of analyses, we generally, and I refer to the fact that we use 2014 because at the time, and we have just published this paper, 2014 was the most recent available data. So now it's coming out, but it will be a while. Now for trade and export, I just want to make two quick comments. The first is that I also see the point and agree with the point raised by Liena, and I think that in some political sensitive industries, we will notice more than in others, changes in those figures and those patterns. Whereas in others, where anyway, sort of the trade and the interconnectedness among firms and countries is so advantageous that it will stay and will remain. So my expectation is to see more changes in those industries that are more politically sensitive than others. And the other point is that it may be, and Liena was making the point of those R&D collaborations, we are also increasing the flow of other types of cross-border activity, meaning digital and information is now flowing through other means. And if we take if we consider globalization as including also flows of information that doesn't necessarily sort of happens, that also happens through this digital patterns and communications, then we should also consider that these changes may actually increase and are increasing other and alternative forms of interconnectedness among individuals, among firms, and among countries. And finally, a note on the fact that we are here, and I think it's a great thing that this webinar has been organized on this topic, because we have seen a terrific increase in the importance and relevance of global value chains. But we also have to consider that still the vast majority of value added of the world's output is created at home. So if we look at averages worldwide, we still see that the dominant part of value creation, with obviously major variation across countries and industries, happens at home. So that also I think it would help in putting into perspective what we can see and the degree of changes that we can expect in the future.
Okay, Gabriel.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be briefer than Liena and Niccolo, but I have some thoughts about this. I'm perhaps less optimistic. Global value chains are totally dependent on a series of well-functioning infrastructures. One is the obvious logistical infrastructure, which I'm not that concerned about, particularly for as even physical goods get a higher content of non-physical elements, and it seems also that transportation and so forth is working, and will be working. So I'm not that concerned about that, but I'm more concerned about the legal and political infrastructure surrounding this, and particularly the obvious reliance on well-functioning multilateral frameworks that are so crucial for the functioning of global value chains, and that has been on the verge of dismantling even lately, and that surely will have some effects on this, and those frameworks are weakening, and that will have an effect on the global value chains, and they will still be there, but they will be shorter, closer, and less associated with the true economics that could have been achieved otherwise. And despite the problems, of course, of reshoring and backshoring and so forth, but still, I think this is not trivial.
Okay, we have a number of questions which are related to performance and what it means to perform in a global value chain. And one of the things that is sort of funny is I actually moderated a webinar yesterday on global value chains, but it was a corporate webinar. And there was a lot of discussion about spontaneous supply systems, on how supply systems changed almost on a dime. One speaker talked about agnostic supply systems, that they're independent of what it is that's actually being produced. And in some sense, we saw with the COVID crisis, as Gabriel has pointed out, stuff actually worked in some ways. It adjusted quickly. The systems that were meant to do A did B, or they did some variation of A, which was different. But I think that a lot of this discussions lose sight of the fact that we don't really have a performance metric here. And also your discussion hasn't really talked on the point of it's a two-way street in some sense, in that knowledge is flowing through the system. In other words, there's a link between global value chains and innovation in the literature. And in other words, it isn't just you produce stuff in one location or you produce it using a network. and even the issues of governance are actually quite mixed up. What does it mean to be kind of the focal firm in a global governance system, a global value chain, when that global value chain is being shared with lots of other multinationals and lots of other local firms, and we're looking at it in a very narrow way. So I guess I want to kind of come back again to Liena in the first instance to sort of say, well, how do we solve this performance conundrum? How can we study something where we don't necessarily know whether what we're talking about really means performance? Michael Moll made the point in his question, isn't it tautological to say that they're superior if they're efficient and survive? Can't we do better than that, in terms of sort of kind of being able to determine what might be the dimensions of this performance? And Michael Nippa asked a question about the Sustainable Development Goals. In other words, are there more things here than we are really kind of paying attention to, and how might we kind of get the work going in that direction? So Liena?
Okay, so let me clarify the point of superiority and sustainability. Yeah. I see how it may come across as tautological. Yeah. What I think is that theoretically, a global value chain is going to be sustained only if it is more efficient to alternatives, let's say complete externalization or full internalization. And efficient, again, from a comparative institutional perspective, means that it has superior economizing properties. So it will be superior to other forms of governance in terms of economizing on bounded rationality and bounded reliability, and creating value for the network. So I think that this is perhaps a fairly straightforward way to conceptualize performance of a global value chain, the performance of a network, is to see whether it actually survives over time, or whether it is converted to an alternative form of governance. Now, of course, I agree that there are multiple dimensions to it, and flexibility is definitely one of them. And this is addressed in a lot of depth in Peter Buckley's work on global factory, which is conceptualized as a system where nothing is above the law, and decisions about location and control are done swiftly and regarding every fine sliced part of the value chain. And this ability to find slice and move quickly and implement changes in a flexible way has also been conceptualized as one of the dimensions of performance. What literature tells us right now is that, I'll echo what you found in your webinar with practitioners yesterday, Tim, is that there's really no consensus on how performance is measured. And this is also something that we flagged as a direction for future research, is how do lead firms in global value chains define and measure performance of the network? So our review for now tells us that we don't know the answer to that. We don't know how lead firms measure performance of the network. We know how they measure their own performance. We know how suppliers measure their performance. We know how academics measure suppliers' performance. It's mostly in terms of functional upgrading. But we don't know how lead firms measure performance. So this is something that we should definitely try to address.
Okay. Gabriel?
The performance, good point, Tim. I think this is one of the weaknesses also more generally of the sort of comparative institutional setup that we rely so much on in transaction cost economics and internalization theory. Because there are some costs of change, and that sort of ruins the picture a little bit, because we may be stuck with inefficient forms, even when there are more efficient forms present, because of our inability to change due to a variety of costs. That's one thing. The other thing is that survival is not a good indicator, because it's a matter of what survives. When just the observation that certain actors survive is not enough. We're talking about the system, but the system is constantly changing, or people go in and out, it gets reconfigured. So what survives? And that makes performance incredibly hard to get at least in sort of with simple metrics and in short term. So perhaps we have to look at performance at different levels. So lead firm survival versus first tier, second tier suppliers, and so forth. And doing that, but it's very, very hard to get that the performance, the whole system as such, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nicola.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on the comment regarding performance. I think Liena and Gabriel tackled already and made excellent point on the status of what we know, and actually it's true. It's certainly interesting and relevant to look for better and more comprehensive measurements method of performance. I just add one comment on the sustainability point that was raised, and that was, if I understood correctly, sort of the second bit, and connected to Gabriel earlier's point on the issues associated with the sort of the demise of multilateralism that sort of we're witnessing these days. And last week, David Tees mentioned that the World Trade Organization called itself out of sort of any relevant discussion because of its avoidance of focus on technology and technology-related issues. The point, and here I link to the real issue of the SDGs and the sustainability that we want to implement and we want to raise as a key concern in global value chains in the future. The presence of a strong multilateral institutions such as the WTO is key to ensure that those global value chains across the world, they run and they function according to principles that are aligned with the SDGs. So we need those institutions more than ever. And I think even before starting to enter into the debate whether the WTO has lost the opportunity to sort of to focus on technology, I think it is true, and perhaps not a reason to be less optimistic, but certainly to look at these points with concern. Nowadays, the WTO doesn't have enough judges to say anything on the disputes that are going on across and amongst countries. And I think strong multilateral organizations are and will be key to ensure that the SDGs will be respected, will become fundamental in global value chains.
Thanks. There's time for one last set of questions, and the questions I'd like to direct to you come from the obvious COVID-19 situation. So we have a whole string of questions related to this, but rather than to let you wax theoretic about the impact of what we don't really know what's going on, and what the impact's going to be of something we don't really know what's going on, I want to focus on a couple aspects of this. So I'm going to give you kind of one last set of comments to make about kind of looking forward in terms of kind of the post-COVID world. And Liena, I'd like you to kind of focus on the issue of governance of global value chains. Gabriel, I'd like you to focus on power and institution, the distribution of power and the use of power in global value chains. And Niccolo also on the institutional side, as you obviously covered, but also the implications for the differential kind of ways in which performance and impact is measured across these. So, Liena.
Again, I'm looking into the future here, but I think one thing that would be interesting to observe is the sustainability of partnerships, specifically in global value chain, especially thinking about small and medium-sized enterprises and smaller suppliers who have been particularly hard hit by the current situation. What can lead firms do to sustain the relationships with their suppliers? Can they be of any help to keep the partnerships going? I'm thinking here of one of the studies that we reviewed on IKEA and its decades-long relationships with small and large suppliers from all over the world, and the way that IKEA nurtured suppliers and then established the relationships for the long term and guaranteed the quality of its inputs. So I think in the post-COVID world, it's going to be really interesting to see whether lead firms manage to maintain their relationships with large and small partners alike. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question directly, but this is something that I'm interested in, and this is something that I would really like to look into.
Yeah, Gabriel.
Yeah, power. Oh, why did I get that question? What strikes me is that the issue of multilateralism that is so important for global value chains really depends on the existence of a strong power, a hegemon, to support that multilateralism. For 60, 70 years, more than 70 years, there's been the US. And that is that setup is coming down quite quickly, and that bothers me. And I see an issue here. On the other hand, I can, so not at the global level, but at the regional level, we've got some new reason for being optimistic on behalf of Europe with the support package that went through. Due to the agreement between France and Germany just yesterday, I think. Now, if we see more of that at the regional level, for example, in Europe, then that bodes well for the future. But then, at least we'll get at least the regional, division of labor going, and perhaps making Europe a more prosperous place for the future. But at the global scale, I see lots of problems. I do, particularly for the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, Niccolo.
Yeah, I think it's difficult sort of not to relate the answer to the two big issues at stake. One is health related, that is actually how the pandemic is going to evolve in the coming months. I think is going to, the length and the type of what we will see in the coming months from purely sort of a health related perspective, and the measures and the evolution of the pandemic is going to have a deep influence on also the consequences on global value chains and behaviors of firms within global value chains. And the other aspect is the political one. And I think it's difficult to entirely sort of discuss a post-COVID-19 world without entering into the debate on how sort of the leading powers in the world are going to take on the future challenges, and how those will shape sort of the interconnections, make it trade related, FDI related, amongst them and amongst all the other nations that sort of will fall within the different blocks, if blocks are to be formed. I think that here there is sort of the possibility of a decoupling or the emergence of different global value chains that then, if that's the case, would have a deep impact on the functioning of global value chains themselves. So I think to actually try, based on the tools we have and the analysis we have done, to try to picture ourselves, to make a sort of estimation of what will happen, I think it's extremely difficult without making a call. And obviously on the health related, we don't know, and we all hope for the better. And on the political ones, we can also, each of us, of course, have our own sort of hopes on the evolution of this. And for instance, in Europe, we do hope to have a strong response at the European level, because that's key and necessary to show that sort of a common and unified response can make things better for the society at large and all the members of the EU. So again, difficult to sort of not enter into this two realms. And again, those are sort of my estimation based off those.
Okay. Okay, thank you. With that, I want to thank all of the speakers, Liena, Gabriel, Niccolo, plus their co-authors who obviously are probably listening in but aren't on the panel today. And I'd like to also thank the audience. I'm going to hand it over to Klaus in a minute, but I just want to let you know that the slides will be available. The video will be available in a slightly edited form on YouTube. And then also all the authors will see the questions, as will the JIBS and JIBP editors. So your questions are not in vain, in the sense that they potentially can lead to sort of kind of reactions later on. So thanks for the questions. Hope I was able to summarize them the best that I could. And over to Klaus to introduce, to give a bit of a summary and to introduce the next webinar. Klaus.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks all the panelists for your contribution. As I was listening to the discussion, I observed again what we often see in AIB, that we have phenomenon at the firm level that we are talking about, and that leads into discussions on policy issues. So this link between firm or even individuals in the world and what that implies to policy is one dimension of what we do at AIB. I just want to share one thought on Tim's last question, that means the COVID-19 impact on global value chains. I think there are two different effects we should separate. One is frictions to the movement of people. That increases certain types of transaction costs that will have especially have impact on the trade and services, and global value chains often have an element of services in there. And then there is a separate effect which arises from nationalist policies, pressures to localize value chains, which politicians think will make their economy less vulnerable. My reading of the literature on global value chains, and I'm not the expert here, but my understanding is that global value chains are actually more resilient if you think of resilience in terms of the ability to find new solutions to problems that arise, because firms that have global networks, global value chains, have more sources they can draw on to solve problems. Okay, so this nationalist policy of pressurizing localization may sort some supply chain robustness issues, short-term vulnerability issues, but actually weakens the resilience of the economy. That's just my view for further discussion. Next week, we're going to talk about international business and digitalization, which actually overlaps with the global value chain in various ways. Digitalization is a means that actually enables more fine-graining of global value chains. It also offers new control mechanisms because of data sharing in real time across partners in the value chain, but also new ways of organizing, including things like platform firm strategies, which I think several of the speakers will talk about. So we will have 3 speakers representing perspectives papers published in the last year in JIBS. And we will also discuss about future research in view of a special issue that is scheduled with a deadline for submissions in September this year. And I hope the ideas from the discussion we have next week will stimulate people towards their contributions to that special issue. And with those remarks, I thank all the participants and hereby end the seminar. Thank you, everyone.